A mercury-gray Pontiac Grandville sits empty under the afternoon sun. Keys in the ignition. Driver's door unlocked. No signs of struggle, no blood, no body. Just a vacant parking spot outside a Detroit suburb restaurant where America's most powerful labor boss was supposed to meet two mobsters for lunch. That was July 30th, 1975. Nearly 51 years later, we still don't know what happened in those missing minutes. This is Noir Docket. I'm your host, and this is the story of Jimmy Hoffa, the vanishing that launched 1,000 theories and turned a restaurant parking lot into the most famous crime scene with no crime. Let's go back to that Wednesday. The temperature in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, hovers around 85 degrees. It's just after 2 p.m. when a stocky man in his early 60s, wearing dark pants and a blue short-sleeved shirt, arrives at the Machu's Red Fox restaurant on Telegraph Road. He's early. That's unusual for the men he's meeting, but typical for him. Jimmy Hoffa doesn't wait for anyone. Except today, he will. The Machu's Red Fox isn't some dive bar. It's an upscale establishment where Detroit's elite come for prime rib and martinis. The kind of place where you can have a conversation without being overheard. Hoffa parks his green Pontiac in the lot and goes inside briefly, then comes back out. The men he's waiting for, Anthony Tony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters official with heavy mob ties, and Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a Detroit Mafia captain, haven't shown up. Witnesses later tell police they saw Hoffa pacing in the parking lot, checking his watch. A few people recognize him. Two men approach, shake his hand, exchange pleasantries. They have no idea they're among the last people to see James Riddle Hoffa alive. At some point, Hoffa uses the restaurant's phone. He calls his wife, Josephine, back at their Lake Orion cottage. The guys are late, he tells her, frustration bleeding through. I'll be home by 4. I'll grill us some steaks. Then he makes a second call, to Louis Linteau, an old Teamsters friend who'd been acting as Hoffa's unofficial scheduler since his release from prison 4 years earlier. Linteau's out to lunch himself. Hoffa leaves a message with staff, complaining again about being stood up. FBI investigators will later reconstruct these calls with obsessive precision. Linteau claims Hoffa phoned him at 3:30 p.m., but the Bureau suspects it was earlier, probably closer to 2:30. The timeline matters because somewhere in those compressed minutes, Jimmy Hoffa stops existing in the known world. One witness reports seeing Hoffa getting into the back of a maroon Lincoln or Mercury sedan with 3 other people. No struggle. No shouting. Just a man getting into a car. By 2:45, maybe 2:50 p.m., Hoffa is gone. 4 o'clock comes and goes. No Hoffa. 5 o'clock. 6. Darkness falls over Lake Orion. Josephine Hoffa, a laundry worker Hoffa had married nearly 40 years earlier during a union strike, waits for the sound of his car in the driveway. The steaks go ungrilled. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Thursday, July 31st, she makes the calls every family dreads. She phones their son, James P. Hoffa, a labor attorney. Then their daughter, Barbara. Your father never came home. Louis Linteau drives to the Machu's Red Fox at 7:20 a.m. He finds Hoffa's Pontiac exactly where it was left the day before, unlocked, undisturbed, keys inside. The parking lot is quiet. Morning commuters drive past on Telegraph Road, oblivious. Linteau stands there for a moment, staring at the empty car, and realizes something unthinkable has happened. By mid-morning, the FBI is involved. By afternoon, it's national news. Within a week, it's a media circus. The Machu's Red Fox becomes the most recognizable restaurant in America for all the wrong reasons. Curious gawkers fill the parking lot. Reporters camp outside, conspiracy theories multiply like bacteria in a petri dish. But here's what makes this case different from every other mob hit, every other unsolved disappearance in American history. Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just some union boss. He was a household name. A man who controlled America's truck drivers, and with them, the entire supply chain of the nation. A man who'd gone head-to-head with a Kennedy and lived. A man with a $1.8 billion pension fund that bankrolled Las Vegas casinos and kept organized crime in business. A man so powerful that even prison couldn't break him. And now he's simply gone. No body. No confession. No closure. Just a green Pontiac in a parking lot and a growing list of theories that, half a century later, still haven't put this case to rest. The question isn't whether Jimmy Hoffa was killed. Everyone, law enforcement, his family, the public, accepts that as fact. He was declared legally dead in 1982. The question is why the mystery endures when the answer seems so obvious. Why do we keep digging up landfills and tearing down buildings searching for his remains when we know who likely ordered the hit, who probably carried it out, and why it had to happen? What is it about this disappearance that won't let America look away? Before Jimmy Hoffa became America's most famous missing person, he was something far more dangerous. A man who controlled whether your groceries arrived at the supermarket, whether your garbage got picked up, whether the mail reached your mailbox. He wasn't elected to any government office. He never commanded troops or sat in a corporate boardroom. But at the height of his power in the 1960s, Jimmy Hoffa ran an organization with 2 million members, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and wielded more practical power over American daily life than most senators or governors ever dreamed of. This is the story of how a kid who dropped out of school in the 9th grade became the most powerful labor boss in American history, and why that power made him a marked man. James Riddle Hoffa, yes, Riddle was his actual middle name, which seems cosmically appropriate given how this story ends, was born February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana. Valentine's Day baby. His father was a coal miner, part of that brutal American tradition where men descended into darkness for pennies and came home covered in black dust, if they came home at all. When Jimmy was 7 years old, his father died. The official cause was lung disease, but young Jimmy understood it differently. His father was killed by the mines, by companies that worked men to death and discarded them like broken equipment. That lesson, that workers were disposable to the people who employed them, became the driving force of Hoffa's life. In 1924, the family moved to Detroit, joining the great migration of workers flooding into Motor City for factory jobs. Jimmy's mother, a former schoolteacher, struggled to feed 4 kids. So at 14, Hoffa dropped out of school and went to work. First as a stockboy, then loading and unloading freight at a grocery warehouse, back-breaking labor for substandard wages in a city that was making Henry Ford a billionaire while workers lined up at soup kitchens. Here's where the origin story gets interesting. In the early 1930s, Hoffa's barely 20 years old. He and his co-workers at the Kroger grocery warehouse are fed up. The company pays them poverty wages, offers no job security, and works them under conditions that would make modern OSHA inspectors weep. So Hoffa does something audacious. He helps organize an unofficial strike. Not with picket signs and permits, but with a work stoppage that shuts down the entire warehouse at the exact moment a shipment of fresh strawberries arrives. Perishable goods. The clock is ticking. Management has hours to negotiate before thousands of dollars of produce rots. Hoffa wins. The workers get their raise. And in that moment, a scrappy kid from Indiana discovers he has a gift. He can organize, negotiate, and when necessary, squeeze until the other side cracks. By 1933, the Teamsters Union notices him. They invite him to become an organizer for Local 299 in Detroit. Hoffa accepts. His method is simple and borderline insane. He drives around Detroit in the middle of the night, pulls up alongside sleeping truck drivers at rest stops, bangs on their doors to wake them up, and delivers his union recruitment pitch before they're fully conscious. Aggressive? Absolutely. Effective. By 1937, at age 24, Jimmy Hoffa is elected president of Local 299. But Hoffa doesn't think locally. He thinks continentally. In the 1940s, he creates the Michigan Conference of Teamsters, consolidating power across the state. By 1947, he's on the Teamsters National Board. By 1952, he's a vice president. And in 1957, at the union's convention in Miami Beach, Florida, Jimmy Hoffa becomes general president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. He's 44 years old and controls the most powerful union in America. Let's pause here to explain something for those who didn't live through the trucking era of mid-century America. The Teamsters weren't just truck drivers, though that was the core. They were warehouse workers, delivery drivers, food processors, airline workers, garbage collectors, vending machine technicians. They were every link in the supply chain that kept American capitalism humming. If the Teamsters went on strike, cities shut down. Literally. No deliveries. No garbage pickup. No fresh food in stores. In a pre-internet, pre-Amazon economy where everything moved by truck, Hoffa controlled the choke points. Under his leadership, Teamsters membership explodes. Wages soar. By the late 1960s, there are stories of university professors quitting their jobs to become long-haul truckers because they can double their salary. Hoffa negotiates a national freight contract that standardizes wages across the country, ensuring that a Teamster in Louisiana makes the same as a Teamster in Oregon. He creates the Central States Pension Fund in 1955, which grows to over $2 billion and provides some of the most generous retirement benefits in the nation. He is, by any measure, a champion of working people. Rank-and-file Teamsters worship him. To them, he's the guy who fought the bosses and won, who made sure their kids had shoes and their families had health care. But here's the problem, and it's the problem that will eventually lead to that parking lot in 1975. To build that empire, Hoffa made deals with devils. The Central States Pension Fund, that golden nest egg for retirees? Hoffa doesn't see it as a sacred trust. He sees it as leverage. He loans millions to Las Vegas casinos controlled by organized crime. He finances real estate deals for mobsters in Florida and Southern California. He moves pension money into banks whose owners have useful connections to the Teamsters. The fund becomes a piggy bank for the Mafia, a revolving door of no-collateral loans that would make any legitimate banker scream in horror. And the mob. They love Jimmy Hoffa. He's their guy. Their union president. Their pipeline to billions in workers' money. But the rest of America is starting to pay attention. In 1957, the same year Hoffa takes over as general president, the AFL-CIO votes nearly 5-1 to expel the Teamsters, citing Hoffa's corrupt leadership. George Meany, the AFL-CIO president, gives an emotional speech demanding Hoffa's removal, saying the labor movement cannot be associated with his methods. Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers leads the charge to kick the Teamsters out. Hoffa doesn't care. He's built an empire, and he's not apologizing for how he did it. The Teamsters are independent now, answerable to no one. He wears the expulsion like a badge of honor. But there's someone else watching Jimmy Hoffa in 1957. Someone with the resources, the obsession, and the legal authority to make Hoffa's life a living hell. His name is Robert F. Kennedy. And he's just getting started. Picture this, August 1957, a Senate hearing room in Washington, D.C. Cameras rolling, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, Klieg lights blazing. At one table sits Jimmy Hoffa, newly elected president of the Teamsters, confident and defiant. At another sits Robert F. Kennedy, 31 years old, chief counsel of the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor or Management, better known as the Rackets Committee. This is their first public confrontation. It will not be their last. What unfolds over the next 8 years is one of the most personal, bitter feuds in American political history. A vendetta disguised as law enforcement. A crusade that some call justice and others call obsession. And it ends with one man in prison and the other dead from an assassin's bullet, both fates arguably sealed by their mutual hatred. The Rackets Committee hearings begin in January 1957, but the seeds are planted earlier. Kennedy, son of a wealthy businessman and brother to an ambitious senator named John, is looking for a cause. Anti-communist witch hunts are out of fashion after McCarthy's downfall. So Kennedy turns his attention to labor racketeering, the cozy relationship between union bosses and organized crime. Reporters who watched him work suggest he investigate the Teamsters, specifically their president Dave Beck and vice president Jimmy Hoffa. Kennedy discovers a gold mine of corruption. Beck is looting union funds for personal expenses. Hoffa is using the pension fund as a mafia piggy bank. Both have connections to underworld figures that would make J. Edgar Hoover blush, if Hoover cared, which he notably doesn't. The FBI director insists the mafia doesn't exist, a position that will age like milk in the sun. But Kennedy cares. He cares a lot. Maybe too much. The first Kennedy-Hoffa confrontation happens before the hearings even start. In March 1957, Kennedy hires an investigator named John Cy Chiesti to infiltrate Hoffa's operation. On March 13, at 11 p.m. in Northwest Washington, Chiesti meets Hoffa and hands him real documents from the Rackets Committee. Hoffa gives him $2,000 cash. FBI agents, tipped off by Kennedy, move in immediately. They arrest Hoffa with the documents still in his possession. Open and shut case, right? Wrong. Hoffa hires Edward Bennett Williams, one of the best defense attorneys in America, who argues that the whole thing is an entrapment scheme orchestrated by Kennedy's obsession. The jury acquits Hoffa. Kennedy is furious. Hoffa celebrates by sending Kennedy a wire that reads, "You will never convict me of anything." Some accounts claim Hoffa flips Kennedy off during one of the Senate hearings, though the photographic evidence is disputed. This is not how you de-escalate a feud. The Rackets Committee hearings run from 1957 to 1959. Over 3 days of testimony in August 1957, Hoffa claims loss of memory 111 times. Kennedy accuses him of using wiretapping equipment obtained through a New York racketeer named Johnny Dio during a 1953 grand jury probe. Hoffa stonewalls, deflects, and occasionally mocks Kennedy's line of questioning. At one point, Kennedy asks why Hoffa didn't investigate corruption in the Teamsters before becoming president, suggesting he's only now seen the light because it's politically convenient. Hoffa fires back with questions of his own, turning the hearing into a verbal brawl. Americans watching on television are transfixed. This isn't dry congressional testimony. This is combat. Two men who genuinely despise each other, circling like boxers, each looking for an opening. Kennedy publishes a book in 1960 called The Enemy Within, chronicling his investigations into labor corruption. Hoffa features prominently, and not positively. The book becomes a bestseller. Kennedy's reputation as a corruption fighter grows. But he's frustrated. Despite hundreds of hours of hearings, thousands of pages of evidence, and public exposure of Teamsters corruption, Hoffa remains untouched. In 1958, Kennedy himself grows weary of pursuing the elusive Jimmy Hoffa, especially after Hoffa beats yet another charge, criminal wiretapping, when the jury votes 11-1 to convict but one holdout forces a mistrial. At the retrial, Hoffa wins again. Then, in 1961, everything changes. John F. Kennedy is elected president. He appoints his younger brother Robert as Attorney General. Suddenly, Bobby Kennedy isn't just a Senate counsel with subpoena power. He's the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, with the full resources of the Justice Department at his disposal. And he has a target list with exactly one name at the top. Kennedy expands the Justice Department's organized crime section from 2 or 3 lawyers to about 60. He creates what becomes known, officially or unofficially, depending on who you ask, as the Get Hoffa Squad. Led by investigator Walter Sheridan, the squad's sole mission is to find something, anything, that will put Jimmy Hoffa behind bars. They convene 13 grand juries. They investigate Hoffa's business dealings, his pension fund loans, his tax returns, his lunch orders, everything. In the American system, this kind of targeted prosecution is legally murky. We have a principle: you investigate crimes, not people. You don't pick a person and then hunt for crimes they might have committed. But Kennedy flips that script. He's investigating Hoffa, and he'll find the crime later. In 1962, prosecutors charge Hoffa with mail and wire fraud related to a trucking company called Test Fleet. Hoffa owned the company but put it in his wife's name for tax purposes. The government argues he was taking illegal kickbacks in violation of the Taft-Hartley Act. The trial, held in Nashville, Tennessee, ends in a mistrial when jurors can't agree on a verdict. But then the government gets a gift. Edward Grady Parton, a Teamsters official from Louisiana with a lengthy criminal record, comes forward. He claims Hoffa tried to bribe jurors during the Nashville trial. Specifically, Hoffa and 5 co-defendants allegedly tampered with the jury to force the hung verdict. In early 1964, Hoffa goes on trial in Chattanooga, Tennessee, for jury tampering. The case is a circus. Hoffa's attorney gets arrested, and ultimately convicted, for trying to bribe a police officer to pay a prospective juror $10,000 to ensure another mistrial. Hoffa's defense team grows increasingly combative, accusing the Justice Department of stealing union documents and accusing Judge Frank W. Wilson of bias. They fiercely cross-examine Parton about his criminal history and accuse him of being a paid government informer, which prosecutors deny. The defense tries every trick in the book to provoke Judge Wilson into losing his temper and declaring a mistrial. Wilson keeps his composure. On March 4, 1964, the jury convicts Hoffa of jury tampering. Judge Wilson, clearly fed up, delivers a scathing rebuke from the bench. You stand here convicted of seeking to corrupt the administration of justice itself. He sentences Hoffa to 8 years in federal prison and fines him $10,000. But Kennedy isn't done. While Hoffa is out on bail appealing the jury tampering conviction, prosecutors put him on trial again, this time in Chicago, on charges related to the test fleet case and improper use of the Teamsters pension fund. After 13 weeks of complex testimony, Hoffa is convicted on July 26, 1964, on 4 counts, 1 count of conspiracy and 3 counts of mail and wire fraud. Judge Richard B. Austin sentences him to 5 years on each count, to run concurrently after he finishes serving the 8-year jury tampering sentence. Hoffa appeals all the way to the Supreme Court. He loses. On March 7, 1967, Jimmy Hoffa, the man who controlled 2 million workers, who dined with movie stars and politicians, who once told Robert Kennedy he'd never be convicted, walks into Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary to begin a 13-year sentence. Kennedy doesn't get to savor the victory for long. He resigns as Attorney General in 1964 to run for Senate in New York. He wins. In 1968, he runs for president. On June 5, 1968, moments after winning the California primary, Robert F. Kennedy is shot by an assassin in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen. He dies the next day. When FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover calls Walter Sheridan to inform him of the shooting, RFK's first thoughts reportedly turned to whether the mob retaliated for his crusade. Sheridan, who'd heard from an informant that Hoffa once expressed a desire to kill Kennedy, briefly wonders if Hoffa was involved. He even travels to Dallas to investigate behind the scenes. Nothing connects Hoffa to RFK's assassination. The shooter, Sirhan, had his own motives. But the fact that investigators even considered it tells you everything about how deep the hatred ran. Hoffa, meanwhile, sits in a Pennsylvania prison cell, watching his empire crumble. Frank Fitzsimmons, his hand-picked successor, is running the Teamsters, and making deals Hoffa never authorized. The mob is happy with Fitzsimmons. He's pliable, predictable, less combative than Hoffa ever was. And Jimmy Hoffa, the man who once controlled America's supply chain, is now just federal prisoner number 33-298N, powerless and forgotten. Or so everyone thinks. December 23, 1971. Jimmy Hoffa walks out of Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary after serving just under 5 years of his 13-year sentence. It's 2 days before Christmas. His wife Josephine is waiting outside. Reporters swarm them. Hoffa smiles for the cameras, looking thinner but defiant. He tells the press he's grateful to President Richard Nixon for his freedom. What he doesn't say, what he perhaps doesn't fully understand yet, is that his release isn't mercy. It's a transaction. And the price tag will come due in blood. This is the chapter where Jimmy Hoffa makes the worst deal of his life without realizing he's making it at all. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. In 1970, Hoffa is 3 years into his sentence, rotting in a Pennsylvania prison while his hand-picked successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, runs the Teamsters. Hoffa had chosen Fitzsimmons carefully, a loyal Detroit guy, a longtime member of Local 299, someone who owed everything to Hoffa. The plan was simple. Fitzsimmons would be a figurehead, a puppet president keeping the seat warm until Hoffa got out. Hoffa even continued trying to run the union from his prison cell, sending instructions through intermediaries. But something unexpected happens. Frank Fitzsimmons discovers he likes being president. He likes the power, the perks, the respect. More importantly, he realizes he doesn't actually need Jimmy Hoffa anymore. Throughout 1967 and 1968, Fitzsimmons consolidates control. He gives the international vice presidents more autonomy, winning their loyalty. He demotes Hoffa loyalists and promotes his own people. When Hoffa's allies on the executive board try to remove Fitzsimmons in July 1967, he defeats the coup attempt. By 1971, Fitzsimmons has fully purged Hoffa supporters from the union's top positions. The mob loves this arrangement. Unlike Hoffa, who was always unpredictable, combative, demanding his cut, Fitzsimmons is compliant. He approves pension fund loans without asking difficult questions. He doesn't threaten to expose anyone. He's exactly the kind of union president organized crime dreams about: weak, controllable, and terrified of losing power. Now enter Richard Nixon, a president with his own problems. The 1972 election is approaching. Labor unions traditionally support Democrats. Nixon needs to peel off some union support if he wants to win. The Teamsters, with their 2 million members and massive war chest, would be a hell of a prize. Transcripts and testimony that emerge years later during Watergate investigations reveal the backroom maneuvering. Nixon's Attorney General John Mitchell and White House Special Counsel Charles Colson discuss the Hoffa situation. They see an opportunity. In June 1971, just months before Hoffa's eventual release, Nixon sends Fitzsimmons a letter suggesting the Teamsters and the administration should work together on economic problems. Translation: endorse me, and I'll make it worth your while. But here's the genius, and the cruelty, of what happens next. Nixon doesn't want Hoffa back in charge of the Teamsters. Fitzsimmons is easier to work with. So Charles Colson, on Nixon's orders, crafts language for Hoffa's release that sounds like freedom but functions like a cage. It's technically called a commutation, not a pardon. Hoffa's convictions still stand, he's just not serving the full time. And crucially, the commutation comes with a poison pill. Hoffa is barred from engaging in the direct or indirect management of any labor organization until March 6, 1980, more than 8 years away. John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel who will later become famous for his Watergate testimony, drafts the exact wording of the restriction. They bypass the normal Justice Department pardon process entirely. On June 19, 1971, Hoffa formally resigns as Teamsters president from his prison cell. On July 9, 1971, Frank Fitzsimmons is elected president in his own right. That same month, Nixon sends his warm letter to Fitzsimmons. In July 1972, the Teamsters break decades of tradition by endorsing a Republican, Richard Nixon, over Democrat George McGovern. And on December 23, 1971, Jimmy Hoffa walks free. Hoffa initially doesn't grasp what's been done to him. He's out of prison. He's home for Christmas. He can see his grandchildren. Life is good. But as weeks turn into months, reality sets in. The restriction isn't some technicality. It's total. He can't run for union office. He can't hold a union position. He can't even work as an unofficial advisor or consultant without violating the terms. And if he violates those terms, he goes back to prison to serve the remaining 8 years. He's been neutered. Politically castrated. The most powerful labor boss in American history has been reduced to a retiree with no portfolio. Hoffa is furious. He immediately accuses Nixon, Mitchell, and Colson of violating his First Amendment rights. How can the government tell him he can't work in his chosen profession? How is that constitutional? Fitzsimmons denies any quid pro quo arrangement, insisting he had nothing to do with the restriction. Nobody believes him. In 1973, Hoffa files a federal lawsuit, Hoffa versus Saxby, named after Attorney General William Saxby. Hoffa's lawyers argue that Nixon exceeded his authority by imposing conditions on the commutation that effectively ban Hoffa from political activity. They demand the restriction be lifted. The case drags through the courts for a year. Depositions are taken. John Dean is called to testify about how the restriction was crafted. The Watergate scandal is exploding around Nixon. Everything is chaos. On July 1974, U.S. District Judge John H. Pratt issues his ruling. He sides with the government. Nixon had unfettered executive discretion when granting clemency, Pratt writes. The conditions placed on Hoffa were reasonable because Hoffa committed his crimes while serving as a Teamsters official. The restriction stands. Hoffa's appeal is denied. Hoffa is out of legal options. So he pivots to Plan B, get back into power by any means necessary. By 1975, Hoffa is openly campaigning to retake the Teamsters presidency in the 1976 union election. The restriction technically doesn't expire until 1980, but Hoffa is betting he can overturn it or find a workaround. He accepts a low-level, non-management position with Local 299 in Detroit, his old power base. It's a humiliating come-down for a man who once controlled the entire international union, but it's a foothold. If he can rebuild influence at Local 299, he can leverage that into support for a presidential run. He's writing an autobiography titled Hoffa, The Real Story, which he plans to publish before the 1976 convention. The book, according to sources who've seen advanced chapters, is explosive. It accuses Fitzsimmons of being a mob puppet. It details pension fund corruption under Fitzsimmons' watch. It promises to expose deals that will destroy Fitzsimmons politically and potentially put several organized crime figures in legal jeopardy. Fitzsimmons is terrified. The mob is alarmed. Both have gotten very comfortable with the current arrangement. A Hoffa presidency would be a disaster. He's unpredictable. He holds grudges. He knows too much. And worst of all, he's angry. 4 years of pent-up rage at being betrayed by his own hand-picked successor. In the spring and summer of 1975, Hoffa starts making noise. He gives interviews. He attends Teamsters events. He shakes hands and reminds people of the old days when wages were rising and the union was feared. Rank-and-file members still love him. To them, Fitzsimmons is a sellout. They want Hoffa back. But wanting something and getting it are two different things. The mob has billions of dollars in pension fund loans on the line. Fitzsimmons has the institutional power of the International Union behind him. And Hoffa? Hoffa has a lawsuit he lost, a book that hasn't been published yet, and a meeting scheduled for July 30, 1975, at a restaurant called the Machu's Red Fox. A meeting with two men who have every reason to want him gone forever. Jimmy Hoffa walks out of prison in December 1971 thinking he's beaten the system. What he doesn't realize is that he's walked into a trap 4 years in the making. The deal was made before he ever left his cell. He just didn't know the terms yet. Now the bill is coming due. To understand what happened on July 30, 1975, you need to understand the two men Jimmy Hoffa was supposed to meet that day. Both named Anthony. Both called Tony. One from New Jersey, one from Detroit. Both connected to organized crime at the highest levels. And both with excellent reasons to want Jimmy Hoffa dead. This is the chapter about the suspects. The men who almost certainly ordered the hit. The men who were never charged, never convicted, and went to their graves without confessing. But whose involvement is so obvious, so well documented, that even the FBI considers it settled fact. Let's start with Anthony, Tony Provenzano. Born in 1917 in New York City, Provenzano rises through two parallel hierarchies simultaneously, the Teamsters Union and the Genovese crime family. By the 1960s, he's president of Teamsters Local 560, in Union City, New Jersey, one of the most powerful locals on the East Coast. He's also a capo, a captain, in the Genovese family, one of New York's 5 Mafia organizations. Think about that for a moment. He's not a union boss with mob ties. He's a made man in La Cosa Nostra who happens to control a union local. That's a crucial distinction. Tony Pro is everything Jimmy Hoffa pretended not to be. Hoffa always maintained he worked with organized crime when necessary but wasn't part of it. Provenzano doesn't bother with the pretense. He uses Local 560 as a personal ATM, stealing union funds, putting relatives on the payroll for no-show jobs, and enforcing his will with violence. In 1961, he's convicted of extortion, shaking down trucking companies for protection money, and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. He serves 4.5 years. Where does he serve that time? Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. The same prison where Jimmy Hoffa arrives in March 1967. At first, the relationship is cordial. Hoffa is Provenzano's mentor, the man who built the Teamsters into a national powerhouse. Tony Pro owes much of his power to Hoffa's protective umbrella. They're both Teamsters. They're both doing time for union-related crimes. In theory, they're allies. Brothers in misfortune. Then comes the fight. The details vary depending on who's telling the story, but the core facts are consistent. Provenzano, while incarcerated, believes he's entitled to continue receiving his Teamsters pension, about $800 per month, roughly $7,000 in today's money. Union rules say convicted felons forfeit pension benefits while serving time, but Tony Pro thinks exceptions should be made for men of his stature. After all, he's a capo. He deserves respect. He also wants access to additional benefits and loan money from the pension fund. Hoffa, even from prison, still wields influence over the pension fund's board. And he refuses Provenzano's request. The answer is no. Union rules are union rules. No exceptions. Provenzano doesn't take rejection well. He confronts Hoffa in the prison yard at Lewisburg. Voices are raised. Insults are traded. According to author Dan Moldia, who has investigated the Hoffa case for decades, the confrontation escalates into a fistfight. Two men in their 50s, throwing punches in a federal penitentiary, surrounded by other inmates. Hoffa supposedly calls Provenzano a punk. In mob parlance, calling someone a punk isn't just an insult, it's a grave disrespect, implying the person is weak, dishonorable, beneath contempt. For a made man like Provenzano, this is intolerable. One witness account claims Provenzano threatened Hoffa during the altercation, promising retaliation once they were both released. Another inmate watching this drama unfold? John Gotti, the future boss of the Gambino crime family, who is also serving time at Lewisburg. Word of the fight spreads through the Mafia grapevine. Everyone knows Tony Pro and Jimmy Hoffa are now enemies. The FBI later learns from informants that Hoffa's fundamental mistake was simple. Hoffa didn't show the appropriate respect for a made guy in prison. In other words, Hoffa treated Provenzano like any other union official rather than genuflecting to his Mafia rank. Former FBI agent Robert Brennan puts it bluntly, Hoffa didn't kiss Provenzano's Cosa Nostra ring. That disrespect becomes a blood debt. After Hoffa's release in December 1971, the feud continues. In the spring of 1974, Hoffa and Provenzano have another bitter argument in Miami. Provenzano allegedly tries to order a hit on Hoffa. Twice, but the LCN Commission, the Mafia's ruling body, blocks it. Hoffa is still too high profile, too politically connected. Killing him would bring heat nobody wants. Tony Pro is told to stand down. But by 1975, circumstances have changed. Hoffa is openly campaigning to retake the Teamsters presidency. He's threatening to expose corruption under Frank Fitzsimmons. He's a problem that's not going away. And the commission decides maybe it's time to solve that problem permanently. Now let's talk about Anthony, Tony Jack, Giacalone. If Provenzano is the out-of-town triggerman, Giacalone is the local fixer. Born into a Detroit Mafia family, Tony Jack is a capo in the Detroit Partnership, Michigan's La Cosa Nostra organization. His brother, Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, is also a mob captain. Together, the Giacalone brothers are the public face of Detroit organized crime in the 1960s and 70s, running gambling operations, numbers rackets, loan sharking, and using Teamsters connections to facilitate it all. Tony Jack's relationship with Hoffa goes back decades. In the 1960s, the Giacalones relied on Hoffa for favors, using his private pilot, arranging loans from the Teamsters pension fund, greasing the wheels for mob investments in Las Vegas hotels. The relationship is symbiotic. Hoffa needs the mob's muscle to maintain control of the Teamsters. The mob needs Hoffa's access to billions in pension money. But it's not all sunshine and cooperation. FBI files reveal that in the early 1960s, Vito and Anthony Giacalone actually plotted to rob a safe in Hoffa's Washington, D.C. apartment. Why? Nobody knows for certain, but it suggests the relationship was always transactional, never truly loyal. The Giacalones even proposed killing Hoffa back then, but Detroit mob boss Joseph Zerilli rejected the idea. In the 1960s, Hoffa was still too valuable. The LCN still needed him. By 1975, Hoffa is no longer valuable. He's a liability. And Tony Jack is the man perfectly positioned to make him disappear. On July 30, 1975, Hoffa believes he's attending a peace conference. He thinks Giacalone has arranged a meeting with Provenzano to settle their prison feud. The plan, as Hoffa understands it, is simple. Sit down with Tony Pro, hash out their differences like adults, and clear the path for Hoffa's return to power. Maybe Provenzano gets his pension reinstated as a goodwill gesture. Maybe they agree to divide territory and avoid stepping on each other's toes. It's a negotiation. That's what Hoffa does. He negotiates. Except there's no negotiation. There never was. Tony Pro isn't coming to the Machu's Red Fox. Tony Jack isn't either. Both men have alibis carefully constructed for that afternoon. Provenzano is in New Jersey, seen by multiple witnesses at a Teamsters office. Giacalone is at the Southfield Athletic Club in suburban Detroit, making sure everyone notices him. The meeting is a setup. The lure to get Hoffa to the right place at the right time so someone we'll meet in later chapters, can pick him up and drive him to his death. Dan Moldia, after decades of investigation, concludes that Provenzano engineered the murder of Jimmy Hoffa. The FBI's secret files, based on Mafia informants, confirm that Tony Pro ordered the killing. His motive: part union politics, blocking Hoffa's comeback, and part personal vendetta. Years later, Tony Pro still hadn't forgiven the disrespect Hoffa showed him in Lewisburg prison. As the FBI's Robert Brennan puts it, so, years later, Tony Pro wrung his revenge. Both suspects live long enough to see the FBI close in, but neither faces charges for Hoffa's murder. Provenzano dies in prison in December 1988, serving a life sentence for ordering the murder of a different Teamsters rival, Anthony Castellito, in 1961. Giacalone dies in 2001, having never been prosecuted for the Hoffa disappearance. The men who planned it are dead. But before we get to the day itself, we need to understand one more player in this tragedy. A man Hoffa trusted completely. A man he considered family. A man who, according to the FBI, drove the car that took Hoffa to his execution. His name is Charles "Chucky" O'Brien. And understanding his role is key to understanding how Jimmy Hoffa vanished without leaving a trace. There's a particular kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than any other, when family turns on you. Not blood family necessarily, but the family you chose. The people you brought into your home, fed at your table, protected when the world turned against them. When those people hand you over to your executioners, it's not just murder. It's something darker. Something that Shakespeare would recognize. This is the story of Charles "Chucky" O'Brien, the man Jimmy Hoffa called his foster son. The man who, according to FBI investigators, drove the car that took Hoffa to his death. The man who spent the last 44 years of his life denying it, protesting his innocence, insisting he'd been framed. And the forensic evidence that makes it almost impossible to believe him. Chucky O'Brien's origin story reads like something out of a mob movie. Born December 20, 1933, he's the son of Sylvia Pagano, a woman who had a brief romantic relationship with Jimmy Hoffa in the early 1940s before Hoffa married Josephine Poziwak. When Chucky's father dies, he's only 6 years old. Hoffa steps in. Not officially. Not legally. But practically. The Hoffas bring Sylvia and young Chucky into their home. Chucky grows up alongside Hoffa's biological children, James P. Hoffa and Barbara. To the outside world, he's Hoffa's foster son, though no formal adoption papers were ever filed. Hoffa treats him like family. Chucky accompanies Hoffa on Teamsters business, travels with him, learns the union game from the master himself. When Hoffa goes to prison in 1967, Chucky is even listed as a family member so he can escort Josephine Hoffa on visiting days at Lewisburg. They fabricated the foster son story to ensure he'd be granted access. Jimmy Hoffa publicly refers to O'Brien as being like a son to him. But here's where the story gets complicated. Chucky's mother, Sylvia, eventually becomes romantically involved with Anthony "Tony Jack" Giacalone, the Detroit mob captain. Think about what that means for young Chucky O'Brien. His surrogate father is Jimmy Hoffa, president of the Teamsters and the most powerful labor boss in America. His mother's boyfriend, essentially his stepfather, is a Mafia capo. Chucky is raised in two worlds simultaneously, the union and the mob. And those two worlds, while frequently overlapping, don't always have aligned interests. By the 1970s, Chucky is deeply involved in Teamsters activities, holding various positions within the organization. But according to multiple sources, he's not particularly good at his job. He makes poor decisions. He screws up assignments. And yet Hoffa grants him latitude that he'd never give anyone else. Why? Because Chucky is family. Because Hoffa raised him. Because you don't abandon your own people, even when they disappoint you. After Hoffa's release from prison in 1971, the relationship between Hoffa and O'Brien remains intact, at least on the surface. In July 1975, just weeks before Hoffa's disappearance, Chucky is still running errands for him, still in his orbit. The Hoffa family believes Chucky and Jimmy are still on speaking terms. Now we arrive at July 30, 1975. The day Jimmy Hoffa disappears. And the day that destroys Chucky O'Brien's life. That morning, Chucky borrows a car from Joseph Giacalone, Tony Jack's son. It's a brand new maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis Brougham. Why does he need to borrow it? His story is straightforward. He's delivering a large frozen salmon, roughly 40 pounds, to Robert Holmes, president of Teamsters Local 337 and a trustee of the Central States Pension Fund. Holmes lives in the Detroit suburbs. Chucky picks up the fish, loads it into the Mercury's back seat, drives to Holmes' house, and helps Holmes' wife cut up the fish. The fish is messy. Blood leaks onto the back seat. Afterward, Chucky takes the car to get gas and has it thoroughly cleaned to remove the bloodstains. That's his alibi. A frozen salmon. And for 44 years, until his death in February 2020, Chucky O'Brien never deviates from that story. Except there's a problem. Multiple problems, actually. Problems that turn Chucky from a peripheral figure into the FBI's prime suspect. First, an eyewitness sees Jimmy Hoffa leaving the Machu's Red Fox parking lot in the back seat of a maroon Mercury. The witness describes Hoffa sitting beside another man who appears to be holding what looks like a rifle or shotgun partially covered by a blanket. The car matches the description of the Mercury that Chucky borrowed. Second, when FBI agents locate the car and obtain a search warrant, they bring in trained police dogs. The dogs detect Jimmy Hoffa's scent in the back seat and trunk of the vehicle. Third, investigators find physical evidence inside the Mercury, hair strands and small quantities of blood. In 1975, DNA testing doesn't exist yet. The evidence is collected and preserved, but they can't definitively prove it belongs to Hoffa. 26 years later, in 2001, forensic science catches up to the case. FBI scientists conduct DNA analysis on the hair strand found in the back seat. The results come back positive. It's a match to hair from Jimmy Hoffa's brush. Jimmy Hoffa was in that car. On August 8, 1975, just 9 days after Hoffa's disappearance, an FBI agent writes an affidavit stating, "I feel that probable cause exists to believe that Charles O'Brien has used Joseph Giacalone's automobile to facilitate an abduction of Hoffa." The government publicly accuses Chucky of picking up Hoffa and driving him to his death. Chucky becomes a leading suspect. When confronted, Chucky denies everything. He insists Hoffa was never in the car. In August 1975, speaking through an anonymous confidant, O'Brien asserts there was no way Hoffa was in the car. He mocks the findings of the canine tests. The blood from the salmon, the scent, contamination, coincidence, incompetent dog handlers, the DNA. He has no explanation that holds water. In September 2001, after the DNA results are made public, FBI agent Andrew Sluss sends O'Brien a handwritten letter. Sluss claims he doesn't consider O'Brien a suspect and tries to convince O'Brien that he can clear his name by taking a polygraph test. O'Brien refuses. Why would an innocent man refuse a lie detector test? O'Brien's attorney doesn't provide a satisfying answer. And the refusal only deepens suspicions. Here's what makes Chucky O'Brien's story so tragic and so suspicious. He's caught between two impossible pressures. On one side, the FBI is publicly accusing him of murder, threatening prosecution, demanding cooperation. On the other side, the mob is exerting very different types of private pressure, as his stepson Jack Goldsmith later writes. If Chucky talks, if he admits anything, the mob kills him. If he stays silent, the government destroys his reputation. He's trapped. Even the Hoffa family turns against him. James P. Hoffa, Jimmy's biological son and Chucky's childhood friend, goes on record stating that the family believed O'Brien knew something and was hiding it. Barbara Hoffa, Jimmy's daughter, shares the same suspicions. The people who grew up with Chucky, who treated him like a brother, now believe he handed their father over to be murdered. The FBI's theory is this: Chucky didn't necessarily know Hoffa was going to be killed. Maybe he thought he was just driving Hoffa to a meeting. Maybe he was told it was a peace conference with Provenzano. Maybe he was pressured by Giacalone, his mother's boyfriend, the man who had influence over his life. Or maybe he did know, and his love for Hoffa was simply weaker than his fear of the mob. The evidence suggests he cooperated, whether willingly or under duress. Descriptions from eyewitnesses at the restaurant matched the person driving the car. Even accounting for questionable testimony, some of it was deemed credible. The several versions Chucky provides to the FBI in August 1975 are full of discrepancies. His alibi timeline has holes. Even if he only had 5 minutes to spare after delivering the salmon, he could have picked up Hoffa and delivered him to what investigators believe was the murder house. In 2019, Chucky's stepson Jack Goldsmith, a Harvard law professor and former assistant attorney general, publishes a book called In Hoffa's Shadow. Goldsmith had been estranged from his stepfather for decades but reconciled late in O'Brien's life. The book is part memoir, part defense. Goldsmith argues that Chucky wasn't involved in the murder, that the forensic evidence can be explained, that Chucky was a scapegoat. But Goldsmith is fighting history, forensic science, and common sense. Jimmy Hoffa's DNA was in that car. Chucky borrowed that car from the son of the mob captain who helped arrange Hoffa's murder. And Chucky, despite 44 years to come up with a better explanation, could never account for how Hoffa's hair ended up in the back seat of a Mercury he was driving. Chucky O'Brien dies on February 13, 2020, at age 86. He never faces charges. He never confesses. He goes to his grave insisting he's innocent, that he loved Jimmy Hoffa, that he would never betray the man who raised him. Maybe that's true. Maybe Chucky O'Brien was a pawn, manipulated by forces beyond his control, caught in an impossible situation where saying no wasn't an option. Or maybe he made a choice, loyalty to Tony Jack Giacalone over loyalty to Jimmy Hoffa. Maybe he drove the car knowing exactly where it was going and what would happen when they arrived. We'll never know for certain. But the car doesn't lie. The DNA doesn't lie. And somewhere in the back seat of that maroon Mercury, during the short drive from the Machu's Red Fox to wherever Hoffa was killed, Jimmy Hoffa must have realized the truth. That the young man behind the wheel, the boy he'd raised, the foster son who called him family, had just delivered him to his executioners. That must have been the longest car ride of Jimmy Hoffa's life. Within hours of Louis Linteau finding Hoffa's abandoned Pontiac on the morning of July 31, 1975, the machinery of American law enforcement springs into action. The FBI's Detroit field office receives the call around 8:30 a.m. By noon, special agents are swarming the Machu's Red Fox parking lot, interviewing staff, canvassing witnesses, documenting the scene. By evening, it's the lead story on every network news broadcast. By the end of the week, it's an international sensation. What begins as a missing persons case quickly evolves into something far more complex. A murder investigation with no body, no crime scene, and suspects who all have ironclad alibis. This is the story of how the FBI tried, and largely failed, to solve America's most famous cold case. The initial response is massive. The Bureau assigns dozens of agents to what they internally call HOFEX, the Hoffa Extortion Investigation. Within weeks, they've interviewed hundreds of witnesses, executed search warrants across 3 states, and compiled thousands of pages of documents. By the mid-1980s, the case file has grown to over 70 volumes. Agents pursue leads in Michigan, New Jersey, Florida, and beyond. They excavate backyards, horse farms, driveways, and fields. They dig up a swimming pool. They tear apart a barn. They use ground-penetrating radar on suspected burial sites. They find nothing. The problem facing investigators is deceptively simple. Without a body, you can't prove a murder occurred. And without witnesses who'll testify, witnesses who aren't terrified of being killed themselves, you can't build a prosecutable case against the suspects you know are guilty. The Mafia's code of silence, omerta, is a wall the FBI can't breach. But they try. God, how they try. The first major break comes from informants inside the mob itself. In November 1975, just 4 months after Hoffa's disappearance, Ralph Picardo, a federal informant with connections to Tony Provenzano's crew, tells investigators that Hoffa's body was placed in a 55-gallon drum, loaded onto a truck, and transported to New Jersey. Specifically, to a landfill in Jersey City operated by Philip, brother Moscato, another Genovese family associate. The FBI considers it the most credible lead they've received. They search the landfill. They find nothing. The site is massive, acres of buried trash, construction debris, and industrial waste. Finding a single barrel in that expanse is like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. But the theory sticks. For decades, investigators will return to New Jersey, convinced Hoffa is buried somewhere under tons of garbage. Meanwhile, the FBI builds a profile of the hit team. Based on wiretaps, informant testimony, and behavioral analysis, they identify the likely conspirators. At the top, Anthony Giacalone and his boss, Giacomo Black Jack Taco, acting on orders from Godfather Joseph Zerilli. The Detroit mob leadership greenlit the hit. Tony Pro in New Jersey bankrolled it and provided muscle. But who actually pulled the trigger? The FBI's working theory identifies 3 men as the hit squad. First, Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, Tony Jack's brother and a Detroit mob enforcer. Second, Anthony Tony Pal Palazzolo, a Detroit soldier known for his willingness to commit violence. And third, the suspected triggerman, Salvatore Sally Bugs Bergoglio, Tony Provenzano's top enforcer from New Jersey. Sally Bugs is a textbook mob killer. Born in 1930, he's a Genovese family soldier who handles Provenzano's dirty work. He has a reputation for brutality and competence. Unlike the Hollywood version of mobsters, Sally Bugs doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't leave witnesses. He doesn't leave bodies where they can be found. If Tony Pro needs someone disappeared, Sally Bugs is the call. Another name surfaces repeatedly, Roland McMaster, a Detroit Teamsters official with deep ties to organized crime. McMaster is mentioned in connection with spurious activities and racketeering. More significantly, Sally Bugs had been working as McMaster's bodyguard before Hoffa's disappearance, a detail that investigative journalist Dan Moldia uncovers years later. The connection between McMaster and Bergoglio suggests coordination between Detroit Teamsters, the local mob, and Provenzano's New Jersey crew. The FBI now has suspects. What they need is a murder scene. Here's where the investigation hits a wall, or more accurately, several walls. Because while they're confident about who killed Hoffa, they can't agree on where it happened. Multiple theories emerge, each supported by credible evidence, each pointing to different locations. Theory 1. The Licata House. Carlo Licata is a Detroit mob soldier whose residence sits just a mile from the Machu's Red Fox. Hoffa had visited the Giacalone brothers at Licata's house several times before. Criminology professor James Buccellato argues that Hoffa was lured there under the pretense that the meeting location had changed. He was informed by the Mafia that the meeting was not going to go down at the restaurant as planned, Buccellato tells Detroit media. He was lured to a location near the restaurant, most likely the house owned by Carlo Licata. Once inside, Hoffa was executed by Detroit mobsters and members of the New York Mafia. Dan Moldia, the investigative journalist who spent decades on this case, initially subscribed to the Licata theory. For years, he appeared on national television discussing his belief that Hoffa was killed at Licata's house, a 5-minute drive north of the Red Fox. But then Moldia changes his mind. Theory 2. The Schultz House. In his more recent work, Moldia now believes the murder occurred at a residence owned by a man named Schultz in Franklin Village, an exclusive community in suburban Detroit. The house is a 10-minute drive from the Southfield Athletic Club, the Jackaloni Cruise Nerve Center, and less than 30 minutes from downtown Detroit. Crucially, the Jackalonis are believed to have handled a similar problem at Schultz's house the year before Hoffa's murder. In other words, they'd already used it as a kill site and knew it was secure. The FBI's Detroit office leans toward this theory. They subscribe to the belief that the homicide conspiracy was orchestrated by Taco and Jackaloni in Michigan, with a hit team consisting of Billy Jackaloni, Tony Pal Palazzolo, and Sally Bugs Bergoglio. So which house was it? After 50 years, we still don't know with certainty. What happens after the murder is equally murky. Buccellato suggests Hoffa's body was taken immediately to either a funeral home on the east side of Detroit, a prominent facility once owned by the Mafia. Alternatively, there were a couple of incinerators in Detroit that were owned by the Mafia. A quick drop, complete incineration, no remains. Or possibly, Buccellato notes, Hoffa was taken to a sausage factory in Detroit. He was possibly ground up. Each scenario is horrifying in its practicality. The mob doesn't rely on exotic disposal methods. They use infrastructure they control: funeral homes with crematoriums, industrial incinerators, meat processing plants. Places where human remains can be destroyed without arousing suspicion. The FBI searches all of them. They find nothing conclusive. By 1976, investigators know they're not going to find Hoffa's body. They shift strategy. If they can't prosecute for murder, maybe they can prosecute for conspiracy, kidnapping, or obstruction of justice. They convene grand juries. They grant immunity to low-level witnesses, hoping someone will crack and testify against the bosses. But omerta holds. Nobody talks. And those who might talk meet unfortunate accidents. On March 21, 1978, Sally Bugs Bergoglio, the suspected triggerman, is shot multiple times on a Manhattan street corner. He dies before reaching the hospital. The hit occurs just as investigators believe he's considering cooperation with authorities. His murder sends a clear message: talking about Hoffa means death. The investigation continues, but the case grows colder. Joseph Zerilli dies in 1977. Tony Jack Jackaloni dies in 2001. Tony Pro dies in prison in 1988. One by one, the conspirators die, taking their secrets with them. Chucky O'Brien dies in 2020. The last witnesses to what really happened are gone. And yet, the FBI doesn't close the case. As of January 2026, 50 years and 6 months after Hoffa's disappearance, the FBI's Detroit field office continues to actively pursue leads. In July 2025, on the 50th anniversary of the disappearance, Special Agent in Charge Chevoria Gibson issues a public statement. As the 50th anniversary of Mr. Hoffa's disappearance approaches, the FBI Detroit field office remains steadfast in its commitment to pursuing all credible leads. The agency maintains a tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI. They urge anyone with information to come forward. They post updates on social media. They re-interview witnesses whose memories might have changed over decades. They use new forensic technology to re-examine old evidence. But here's the reality: every investigator who's worked the case believes they know what happened. They know who ordered it, who carried it out, and approximately where it occurred. What they don't have, what they've never had, is evidence that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The Hoffa investigation represents a perfect storm of obstacles. The mob's code of silence. The destruction of the body. The passage of time. Witnesses who recant or disappear. Physical evidence that's suggestive but not conclusive. A crime that was meticulously planned and flawlessly executed. Dan Moldia, who's investigated this case longer than almost anyone alive, puts it simply, that's the truth, whether we ever find Hoffa's body or not. We know what happened. We just can't prove it in court. And so the hunt continues. 50 years of searching. 70 volumes of case files. Hundreds of agents. Millions of dollars spent. Dozens of excavation sites. And at the end of it all, Jimmy Hoffa remains exactly where he's been since July 30th, 1975. Gone. Somewhere, buried or incinerated or dissolved in acid, the most powerful labor boss in American history rests in an unmarked grave. His killers are dead or dying. The mob organizations that ordered his execution have been decimated by RICO prosecutions. The Teamsters union he built has been reformed and largely cleaned of corruption. Everyone involved in the conspiracy is gone. Except one thing, the mystery itself. That endures. That haunts us. That keeps FBI agents working a case file that grows by the year even as the chances of solving it shrink by the day. Jimmy Hoffa achieved immortality, just not the kind he wanted. He's not remembered for building the Teamsters or fighting for workers' rights. He's remembered for vanishing. For becoming America's most famous missing person. For proving that even in the modern age, with all our forensic science and investigative techniques, a determined group of killers can make someone disappear completely. And the most terrifying part? It's probably happened dozens of other times. We just don't know about them because those victims weren't famous. If you've heard of Jimmy Hoffa, you've probably heard he's buried under Giants Stadium. It's become American folklore, repeated in bars and barbecues, referenced in movies and TV shows. The image is irresistible. The most powerful labor boss in history entombed beneath the end zone where 80,000 football fans unknowingly stomped on his grave every Sunday. There's just one problem. It's almost certainly not true. This chapter is about the theories, the wild, desperate, sometimes absurd attempts to answer the question that's haunted America for 50 years. Where is Jimmy Hoffa's body? The Giant Stadium theory originates with Donald "Tony the Greek" Frankos, a self-described mob hitman who tells Playboy magazine in 1989 that Hoffa was buried under Section 107 of the stadium during construction in 1975. The story has everything: mob intrigue, a famous landmark, and enough plausibility to capture imaginations. At the time of Hoffa's disappearance, Giant Stadium was indeed under construction in East Rutherford, New Jersey. The FBI investigates and finds nothing to support the claim. In 2004, the Discovery Channel's Mythbusters scans the stadium with ground-penetrating radar. No disturbances. No body. In 2010, when Giant Stadium is demolished to make way for MetLife Stadium, construction crews find no human remains. The theory dies with the building. But the searches don't stop. Because if there's one thing the Hoffa case has produced, it's theories. Dozens of them. Each pointing to a different hole in the ground. September 1975, FBI agents dig up a farm in Waterford Township, Michigan, 15 miles from the Machu's Red Fox. A Mafia informant swears Hoffa is buried there. They excavate for 3 days. Nothing. November 1975, investigators search a landfill in Jersey City, acting on a tip from Ralph Picardo, who claims Hoffa's body was placed in a steel drum and transported to a dump operated by Philip, brother, Moscato. The FBI obtains a warrant, but never executes the full excavation. The warrant expires. Decades later, in 2021, the FBI returns to the same area based on fresh testimony from Frank Coppola, whose father allegedly owned the landfill and personally buried Hoffa. They dig again. Nothing. The list continues: a trash compactor at a Detroit restaurant. A cornfield 100 miles southwest of the city. A poker club in California. A construction site in Marion, Michigan. A farm near Milford Township, Michigan, where Teamsters official Donovan Wells claims Hoffa was buried. The FBI digs for 2 weeks and finds nothing. In 2013, police dig beneath a barn in Oakland Township, Michigan, based on a tip. Nothing. In 2023, a group called the Casebreakers claims Hoffa's body was secretly reburied in 1995 under third base at Milwaukee's Old County Stadium before demolition. The theory is based on clues written on a playing card from the 1990s. Nobody digs. Each search generates headlines. Each failure deepens the mystery. Then there's Frank, the Irishman Sheeran, whose deathbed confession became the basis for Martin Scorsese's 2019 film The Irishman. Sheeran, a Teamsters official and alleged mob enforcer, claims in conversations with author Charles Brandt that he shot Hoffa twice in the back of the head on orders from mob bosses. The story is detailed, cinematic, and deeply problematic. Sheeran gives 3 different confessions. In one, he disposes of Hoffa's body after someone else kills him. In another, he shoots Hoffa in a car and drives the body to an undisclosed location. In the third, the one Brandt publishes, Sheeran shoots Hoffa in a Detroit house before other men cremate the body. Brandt also claims Sheeran provided a letter from Hoffa. That letter is later proven to be forged. Jack Goldsmith, Chucky O'Brien's stepson and a Harvard law professor, eviscerates Sheeran's account in the New York Review of Books. He points out the contradictions, the lack of corroboration, the convenient timing of the confession, given only after most witnesses were dead and couldn't dispute it. The FBI doesn't consider Sheeran credible. Most experts believe Salvatore Bergoglio, Sally Bugs, was the triggerman, not Sheeran. But Sheeran's story is more Hollywood-ready, an Irish-American truck driver turned mob killer, a final confession of guilt, redemption through admission. The truth is messier and less satisfying. So why do these theories persist? Why does America keep digging holes 50 years later? Because we need closure. Because not knowing feels worse than knowing something terrible. Because the idea that someone can simply vanish, that the most powerful labor leader in the country can be erased from existence with no trace, is fundamentally terrifying. It suggests the system failed. That justice is optional. That if it can happen to Jimmy Hoffa, it can happen to anyone. And perhaps most disturbingly, it suggests the mob won. They killed him, hid the body, and got away with it. Complete victory. That sticks in America's throat like a bone we can't swallow. So we keep searching. We dig up football stadiums and landfills and farms. We chase rumors and deathbed confessions and cryptic playing cards. We scan the ground with radar and cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating sonar. We do everything except accept the obvious truth. Whoever disposed of Jimmy Hoffa's body did a perfect job. And they're not telling. 7 years. That's how long the law requires before a missing person can be declared legally dead in Michigan. 7 years of waiting, searching, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, there's been a mistake. That the person will walk through the door with an explanation that makes sense of the nightmare. For the Hoffa family, those 7 years must have felt like 70. On December 9, 1982, Oakland County Probate Judge Norman R. Barnard signs the order. James Riddle Hoffa is declared legally dead as of July 30, 1982, exactly 7 years after his disappearance. No body. No crime scene. No confession. Just a legal fiction that allows his estate to be settled and his survivors to move forward. Josephine Hoffa doesn't live to see that day. Jimmy's wife of 41 years dies on September 12, 1980, 2 years before the official declaration. She's buried at Whitechapel Memorial Cemetery in Troy, Michigan. Her grave includes a headstone for Jimmy, an empty plot beside her, waiting for remains that will never come. It's a monument to absence, a marriage that ended without closure. Their children, James P. Hoffa and Barbara Ann Crainser, are left with a peculiar form of grief. They know their father is dead. Everyone knows. But without a body, without justice, the wound never quite closes. It festers across decades. James P. Hoffa follows his father into the Teamsters, becoming a labor attorney and eventually, in 1999, general president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the same position his father held. It's a redemption arc of sorts, reclaiming the family legacy. But Jimmy's disappearance casts a shadow over everything. Every interview, every profile, every speech inevitably circles back to that day in 1975. The son can never escape the father's ghost. The Teamsters themselves undergo radical transformation after Hoffa's disappearance. Frank Fitzsimmons continues as president until his death in 1981, maintaining cozy relationships with organized crime the entire time. But by the late 1980s, federal prosecutors have had enough. In 1989, the Justice Department files a civil RICO lawsuit against the Teamsters, alleging the union is essentially a criminal enterprise controlled by La Cosa Nostra. The union agrees to a consent decree rather than face trial. The government imposes federal oversight, an independent review board with power to remove corrupt officials, monitor elections, and investigate mob influence. It's an unprecedented intrusion into union governance, a tacit admission that the Teamsters cannot police themselves. The oversight continues for 26 years, finally ending in January 2015. The irony is bitter. Jimmy Hoffa built the Teamsters into the most powerful union in America. His disappearance, and the mob's infiltration that led to it, nearly destroys what he created. By trying to reclaim power in 1975, Hoffa set in motion events that would strip the Teamsters of autonomy for a generation. But perhaps the strangest legacy of Hoffa's disappearance is cultural. He becomes myth. A punchline. A reference so ubiquitous that people born decades after 1975 instantly recognize the name. "Where's Jimmy Hoffa?" becomes American shorthand for unsolvable mysteries. Politicians joke about finding Hoffa's body during infrastructure projects. Comedians mine the case for material. Hollywood produces films, Hoffa with Jack Nicholson in 1992, The Irishman with Al Pacino in 2019. Television shows reference him constantly. He appears in everything from The Simpsons to serious documentaries. Historians debate why this particular disappearance captured the national imagination so completely. Hundreds of people vanish every year. Most are forgotten. But Hoffa endures. Perhaps it's the intersection of celebrity, mystery, and implied violence, the same formula that keeps people obsessed with Amelia Earhart's disappearance in 1937. Perhaps it's because Hoffa represented power, and watching power destroyed satisfies something primal in our psychology. Or perhaps it's simpler: we can't accept that in modern America, with all our forensic tools and investigative resources, someone can simply vanish. Author and crime historian Scott Bernstein suggests the mystery grew stronger precisely because no remains were found. This was something they believed was a flawless crime, and in many respects, it was, Bernstein tells reporters in 2025. The Detroit mob family behind the hit operates in secrecy. They prefer to remain unnoticed. They didn't expect people would still be talking about this 50 years later. But we are. We're still talking. Still digging. Still theorizing. The case has become larger than the man. Jimmy Hoffa the person, complex, flawed, ruthless, effective, has been replaced by Jimmy Hoffa the symbol. A mystery that transcends the facts. A legend that resists resolution. And maybe that's fitting. Because legends don't need bodies. They don't need closure. They need only questions that refuse to die. Jimmy Hoffa is presumed dead. The law says so. Common sense says so. But America can't quite let go. We visit the spot where his Pontiac was found. We watch documentaries. We click on articles promising new theories. We keep the case alive because letting it die feels like admitting defeat. Somewhere, Jimmy Hoffa's remains rest in an unmarked location. And somewhere, the people who put him there are laughing at how completely they erased him, and how eternally famous they made him in the process. August 1976. Exactly 1 year after Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, FBI agents and federal prosecutors convene a grand jury in downtown Detroit. Their targets: 3 men from New Jersey with connections to Tony Provenzano and ties to organized crime, Thomas Andretta and brothers Gabriel and Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Bergoglio. All 3 have provided alibis for July 30, 1975. All 3 claim they were playing cards at Teamsters Local 560, in Union City, New Jersey, when Hoffa vanished. The FBI believes they're lying. Now they need to prove it. This is the chapter where the investigation reaches its critical phase, where prosecutors try to dismantle alibis, where forensic science catches up to decades-old evidence, and where witnesses face the impossible choice between testifying against the mob or facing perjury charges themselves. The grand jury strategy is methodical. Investigators grant immunity to 4 witnesses in exchange for testimony. Karen Schnabel, a secretary at Local 560. Frederick Furino, a union member. 2 business agents named Castito and Chompy. The calculation is simple. These people can't refuse to testify if they're protected from prosecution. And without the Fifth Amendment shield, they'll have to tell the truth or face perjury charges. But there's a problem. Omerta, the Mafia code of silence, is stronger than legal immunity. Even with protection, witnesses don't want to talk. Some claim memory loss. Others provide contradictory statements that make their testimony useless in court. One informant who initially told the FBI that Frank Fitzsimmons met with mob figures shortly before Hoffa's disappearance refuses to repeat the story under oath. Without sworn testimony, the Justice Department concludes there's no legal basis to compel Fitzsimmons to appear before the grand jury. The alibis hold. The card game at Local 560 becomes the official story, corroborated by just enough witnesses to create reasonable doubt. Sally Bugs Brigaglio walks free. Thomas Andretta walks free. Gabriel Brigaglio walks free. The FBI knows they're involved. Proving it is another matter entirely. But investigators don't give up. They shift focus to Detroit, to the physical evidence collected in the first days after Hoffa's disappearance. Specifically, to that maroon Mercury Marquis Brougham that Chucky O'Brien borrowed from Joseph Giacalone. When FBI agents first searched the car in August 1975, they found hair strands and small quantities of blood in the back seat. Chucky insisted the blood came from a 40-pound frozen salmon he'd delivered that day. The hair. Contamination, maybe. Or it belonged to one of the Giacalones who regularly used the car. Without DNA testing, which doesn't exist yet in 1975, investigators can't definitively prove the hair belongs to Hoffa. So they preserve the evidence. They store the hair samples carefully, documenting chain of custody, maintaining proper forensic protocols. They wait for science to catch up. That moment arrives in 2001. 26 years after Hoffa's disappearance. FBI forensic scientists conduct mitochondrial DNA testing on the hair strands found in the mercury. This type of testing, developed fairly recently, is especially valuable for hair samples because it produces reliable results even when the material is old or incomplete. They compare the unknown sample to hair taken from Jimmy Hoffa's brush, evidence preserved by his family and provided to investigators decades earlier. The results come back, match. Jimmy Hoffa was in that car. The DNA doesn't lie. Hoffa sat in the back seat of the Mercury that Chucky O'Brien drove on July 30, 1975. Which means Chucky's story about the salmon, about never transporting Hoffa, about having nothing to do with the disappearance, it collapses under the weight of molecular biology. James P. Hoffa, Jimmy's son and by then president of the Teamsters, speaks to the press after learning of the DNA results. Both the authorities and members of Hoffa's family were convinced that Hoffa was lured into a trap with the promise of a fictitious peace council, he tells reporters. And they believe O'Brien played a role because, as I said, my father's implicit trust in O'Brien would have disarmed his normal wariness in such situations. The DNA evidence is powerful. But it's also limited. It proves Hoffa was in the car. It doesn't prove who killed him, where he was killed, or where his body was disposed of. And critically, by 2001, the statute of limitations has expired on many potential charges related to the kidnapping. Several key suspects are already dead. Sally Bugs was murdered in 1978. Tony Pro died in prison in 1988. Tony Jack Giacalone is elderly and in declining health. The FBI considers reopening the case, armed with this new forensic evidence. But prosecutors face the same problem they've always faced. Proving murder without a body is extraordinarily difficult. The DNA puts Hoffa in O'Brien's car, yes. But defense attorneys can argue Hoffa got in voluntarily. Maybe they drove somewhere to talk. Maybe Hoffa left the car alive. Maybe someone else killed him later. Reasonable doubt infects every theory. And then there's the reliability question. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, FBI forensic hair analysis comes under scrutiny. A 2015 investigation reveals that FBI agents gave flawed or erroneous testimony in at least 90% of microscopic hair analysis cases reviewed. While the Hoffa DNA evidence used newer, more reliable mitochondrial testing rather than older microscopic comparison techniques, defense attorneys would inevitably raise doubts about FBI forensic methods. The investigation stalls again. The DNA breakthrough that seemed so promising in 2001 doesn't lead to charges. Witnesses continue refusing to cooperate. The few who might talk are terrified. One retired FBI agent who worked the case later reflects, "The Mafia must have known that killing Hoffa would result in tremendous investigative pressure, which it did. But the mob calculated correctly. By disposing of Hoffa's body in a way that it could never be found, limiting the number of people who had knowledge and practicing omerta, the Mafia code of silence, they could weather the resulting investigation." And they did. Despite 50 years of investigation, despite forensic breakthroughs, despite grand juries and immunity grants and relentless FBI pressure, not a single person has ever been charged with Jimmy Hoffa's murder. The mob won this round. They committed a nearly perfect crime. Nearly because we know they did it. We just can't prove it beyond reasonable doubt. The grand jury investigations of the 1970s crumbled against walls of silence. The DNA evidence of 2001 proved Hoffa was in the car but couldn't identify his killers. The hundreds of witness interviews produced contradictions, memory gaps, and strategic amnesia. Every potential breakthrough hit a dead end. Somewhere in those gaps, between what investigators know and what they can prove, lies the truth about July 30, 1975. A truth protected by dead men, terrified witnesses, and the simple fact that without a body, murder is almost impossible to prosecute. The walls closed in. But they didn't close tight enough. 50 years of investigation. Hundreds of FBI agents. Thousands of witness interviews. Dozens of theories. And yet, when you strip away the noise, the giant stadium myths, the deathbed confessions, the sensational claims, a consensus emerges among serious investigators about what happened on July 30, 1975. This is the chapter where we reconstruct the crime. Not with certainty, we'll never have that without a confession or a body. But with the weight of evidence, informant testimony, and decades of investigative work pointing toward one conclusion. The FBI's working theory, supported by organized crime experts and investigative journalists who've spent decades on this case, goes like this. Jimmy Hoffa arrives at the Machu's Red Fox around 2 p.m., expecting to meet Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone for a peace conference. He waits in the parking lot. The meeting is a fabrication. Neither Tony Pro nor Tony Jack ever intended to show up. Both men have alibis carefully constructed for that afternoon. Provenzano is in New Jersey, visible at Teamsters Local 560. Giacalone is at the Southfield Athletic Club in suburban Detroit, making sure people notice him. Around 2:30 or 2:45 p.m., a maroon Mercury pulls into the parking lot. Chucky O'Brien is driving. We know this because witnesses describe someone matching O'Brien's appearance behind the wheel. We know this because Hoffa's DNA was later found in the back seat of that car. And we know this because Hoffa trusts Chucky implicitly. His foster son, the boy he raised, would never betray him. Chucky tells Hoffa there's been a change of plans. The meeting has been moved to a nearby house. This wouldn't alarm Hoffa. Location changes happen in the mob world. Security concerns. Privacy considerations. It makes sense. And because it's Chucky delivering the message, Hoffa doesn't hesitate. He gets in the car. The house is less than 10 minutes away. Either the Licata residence or the Schultz house in Franklin Village. Investigators disagree on which, but both are mob-connected properties within a short drive of the Red Fox. Hoffa sits in the back seat. Maybe there's another man beside him, partially concealing a weapon under a blanket. An eyewitness reported seeing this. Maybe Hoffa realizes something is wrong during that drive. Maybe he doesn't. They arrive at the house. Hoffa gets out. He walks inside, still believing this is a negotiation, still thinking he's meeting with Provenzano's representatives. Inside, 2 or 3 men are waiting. Based on FBI informant testimony and social network analysis of the conspiracy, the hit team most likely consists of Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Bergoglio, Tony Pro's enforcer from New Jersey, and Anthony, Tony Pal Palazzolo, a Detroit mob soldier. Possibly Vito, Billy Jack, Giacalone as well, though some sources suggest he stayed outside as a lookout. What happens next is where the accounts diverge. Scott Bernstein, a Detroit organized crime historian who's investigated the case for decades, admits, "I can't say definitively how Hoffa was killed. He might have been shot, strangled, or beaten to death." Reliable sources have suggested all 3 possibilities. An FBI wiretap allegedly captured conversations suggesting Palazzolo carried out the actual killing under Tony Jack Giacalone's orders. The most credible reconstruction suggests Hoffa was shot, 2 bullets to the head at close range. Quick. Efficient. The kind of execution mob hitmen have perfected. Hoffa probably never saw it coming. One moment he's walking into what he thinks is a meeting. The next moment, he's dead on the floor. But killing Hoffa is only half the problem. Disposing of the body, making sure it's never found, is what separates this from a typical mob hit and transforms it into an enduring mystery. Here's where the story gets truly grim. Multiple sources, including Bernstein's research and FBI informant testimony, point to the same disposal method. Hoffa's body was transported to a mob-connected facility, most likely Central Sanitation Services, a Detroit sanitation company with ties to organized crime. There, according to Bernstein's theory corroborated by wiretap evidence, the body was put through an industrial meat grinder. Yes. You read that correctly. Jimmy Hoffa, the most powerful labor boss in American history, was reduced to hamburger meat. The theory isn't just sensationalism. An FBI wiretap allegedly recorded Palazzolo discussing this disposal method. The Central Sanitation Facility had the equipment, industrial meat processing machinery powerful enough to pulverize a human body completely. And crucially, the facility mysteriously burned down a few months after Hoffa's disappearance, destroying any potential evidence. After the grinding, what remained was likely incinerated at the same facility or at a mob-controlled funeral home with cremation equipment. Complete destruction. No bones. No teeth. No identifiable remains. Just ash. They executed the perfect crime, but it was almost too flawless, Bernstein reflects. Their effectiveness in eliminating the body has kept the search for it alive. This theory, call it the consensus theory, is supported by 3 authoritative investigative sources and holds up under social network analysis. Anthony Giacalone, Anthony Provenzano, and Salvatore Bergoglio were the principal architects. All 3 had the means, motive, and opportunity. All 3 had the highest social network analysis metrics of anyone in the conspiracy, suggesting intimate knowledge even if they weren't personally present at the killing. But why? Why kill Hoffa at all? The obvious answer, he was threatening to reclaim the Teamsters presidency and expose pension fund corruption, is only part of the story. Bernstein uncovered another motive. By spring 1975, rumors were circulating on the street that Hoffa might be a confidential FBI informant. Whether true or not, the perception was deadly. The mob doesn't take chances with informants. If there's even a possibility someone might cooperate with federal investigators, that person becomes a liability. Add to that Hoffa's combative personality, his threats against Fitzsimmons, his unpredictability, and his knowledge of decades of mob Teamsters corruption. Hoffa wasn't just a problem. He was a time bomb. The Detroit mob and Provenzano's New Jersey crew decided the safest course was permanent elimination. And they did it perfectly. No body. No confession. No prosecution. 50 years later, everyone involved is dead. Tony Jack died in 2001, Tony Pro in 1988, Sally Bugs was murdered in 1978, Palazzolo is deceased, Chucky O'Brien died in 2020. They took their secrets to the grave. Jack Goldsmith, Chucky O'Brien's stepson and a Harvard law professor, acknowledges the educated consensus among investigators. Even while defending his stepfather's innocence, Goldsmith concedes that the FBI believes Giacalone and Provenzano organized the hit and used O'Brien, willingly or unwittingly, as their instrument. This is what happened. Not proven in court. Not beyond all doubt. But beyond reasonable doubt? Absolutely. The evidence points to a carefully orchestrated mob hit, executed by professional killers, with the body disposed of so thoroughly that 50 years of searching has produced nothing. Jimmy Hoffa walked into that house believing he was negotiating peace. He walked into an execution. And within hours, he ceased to exist as anything more than ash and memory. 50 years. Half a century of investigation, speculation, and searching. It's time to separate what we know from what we believe, fact from theory, evidence from legend. This is the final accounting of the Jimmy Hoffa case, what's proven, what's disputed, and why it still matters in 2026. What we know for certain. Jimmy Hoffa went to the Machu's Red Fox restaurant on July 30, 1975, expecting to meet Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone. He never returned home. His car was found unlocked in the parking lot the next morning. Neither Provenzano nor Giacalone came to the meeting. Both had alibis placing them elsewhere. Hoffa was in the back seat of a maroon Mercury Marquis brougham borrowed by Chucky O'Brien on July 30, 1975. DNA testing in 2001 proved this conclusively. O'Brien consistently denied Hoffa was ever in the car, but molecular biology doesn't lie. Hoffa was murdered. The FBI has never wavered on this point. He was declared legally dead in 1982. No credible investigator believes he's alive, in hiding, or died of natural causes. This was a mob hit. The conspiracy involved high-level organized crime figures in both Detroit and New Jersey. The investigation has identified the likely architects and executioners. No one has been charged because the evidence, while compelling, doesn't meet the threshold for prosecution without a body or cooperating witnesses. What remains disputed? The exact location where Hoffa was killed. Investigators debate whether it was the Licata House or the Schultz House, both in suburban Detroit. Both properties had mob connections. Both were within minutes of the Red Fox. The disposal method. While the industrial meat grinder theory is supported by multiple sources and wiretap evidence, some investigators believe Hoffa was incinerated intact at a funeral home or sanitation facility. Others think he was buried in New Jersey. The competing theories reflect how thoroughly the body was hidden. Chucky O'Brien's level of knowledge. Was he a willing participant who knew Hoffa would be killed? Or was he manipulated into driving Hoffa, believing it was simply a location change for the meeting? His stepson Jack Goldsmith argues for the latter. The FBI leans toward the former. We'll never know for certain now that O'Brien is dead. 3 theories, ranked by probability. Theory 1. The consensus, 85% probable. Hoffa was lured into O'Brien's car, driven to a mob-connected house in suburban Detroit, and executed by a hit team led by Salvatore Bergoglio on orders from Provenzano and Giacalone. His body was transported to Central Sanitation Services in Hamtramck, put through an industrial meat grinder, and incinerated. This theory is supported by FBI wiretaps, multiple informants, forensic evidence, and decades of investigative journalism by Dan Moldia, Scott Bernstein, and others. Theory 2. New Jersey landfill, 10% probable. Based on informant testimony from Ralph Picardo in 1975 and Frank Coppola in 2020, Hoffa's body was placed in a steel drum and buried in a Jersey City landfill beneath what's now an elevated highway. The FBI conducted searches in 1975 and 2021, finding nothing. But the site is massive, and the original warrant was never fully executed. It's possible Hoffa is there, just never found. Theory 3. Alternative disposal, 5% probable. Hoffa was killed as described in Theory 1, but his body was disposed of differently. Buried under concrete at a construction site, dropped into the Great Lakes, or incinerated at a funeral home controlled by the Detroit mob. Multiple variants exist. Most lack supporting evidence beyond single-source claims. They can't be entirely ruled out, but they're not supported by the weight of investigation. Why this still matters. David Whitwer, a Penn State historian who lectures on the Hoffa case, argues that Hoffa's disappearance had monumental consequences. For organized crime, it triggered an aggressive FBI crackdown that decimated La Cosa Nostra through RICO prosecutions. For organized labor, it created widespread anti-labor sentiment and policies that continue to this day. The Hoffa case became proof that unions were corrupt and dangerous, fodder for politicians seeking to weaken labor protections. The transactional relationship between unions and organized crime, born of necessity in industries controlled by violence and bribery, destroyed public faith in the labor movement. Hoffa's disappearance symbolized everything Americans feared about union power gone wrong. And there's something deeper. Hoffa's vanishing challenges our fundamental belief in justice. In modern America, with forensic science and surveillance and investigative resources, we expect closure. We expect bodies to be found, killers to be caught, justice to be served. The fact that a celebrity, someone as famous in 1975 as a Tom Brady or LeBron James today, could simply vanish without trace is profoundly unsettling. It suggests power beyond the law. An invisible cabal that operates with impunity. The idea connects to conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination, about secret governments, about forces that control events from the shadows. Hoffa's disappearance feeds that narrative. It proves, at least in this one case, that the underworld could eliminate anyone and get away with it. As of July 2025, the 50th anniversary, the FBI Detroit field office maintains the case is active. They continue pursuing credible leads. They maintain a tip line. Special Agent Chavoria Gibson's statement is clear: the FBI remains steadfast. But realistically, everyone who had direct knowledge is dead. The crime occurred 50 years ago. Forensic evidence has been analyzed and reanalyzed. Witnesses have been interviewed hundreds of times. Informants have told everything they know. The case won't be solved unless someone discovers remains, and after half a century, that's increasingly unlikely. Jimmy Hoffa achieved a perverse immortality. He's not remembered for building the most powerful union in America or fighting for workers' rights. He's remembered for vanishing, for becoming a punchline, a mystery, a symbol of unsolved crimes and mob power. That's his legacy, a question without an answer. We know what happened. We just can't prove it. And maybe that's the most American ending of all, a system that came so close to justice but ultimately fell just short. Evidence without prosecution. Knowledge without conviction. Truth without closure. Somewhere beneath Detroit or New Jersey or scattered as ash, Jimmy Hoffa rests. His killers died without confessing. The mob won this round. And the mystery endures, not because we don't know the truth, but because we can't accept that knowing isn't enough. One final question for you. If we know who killed Jimmy Hoffa and how they did it, but can't prove it in court, is that justice? Or is that the perfect crime? Leave your answer in the comments.